Welcome to SEXED, the sex ed channel. Today we're going to be talking about anatomy and biological sex and how it's not as straightforward as most people think. Buckle up, kiddos. There's science talk ahead. You knew it was coming, and the moment is here. It's time to talk about genitals. Not just genitals, though. Technically, genitals are only the exterior sex organs. They're the ones visible from the outside, also known as the primary sex organs. The secondary sex organs are the ones that are hidden away inside your body, and since those are just as important, despite the name, we're going to be talking about those too. You know, I think penises get to go first a lot of the time, so we're going to start with vaginas. Many people refer to everything in the female genital area as the vagina, but that's not accurate. In fact, because the vagina is actually the canal that leads inside the body, I'm not 100% certain why doctors classify it as part of your genitals at all. I mean, you can kind of see it from the outside, but it is definitely internal. Anyway, the female genital area is properly called the vulva, and this is what a cartoon of it looks like. Now, as cartoons go, this isn't a terrible representation. You can see the labia majora, which are kind of like the outer boundaries of everything. The labia minora, which are those internal folds. The vaginal opening, the urethra, and while it's not specifically labeled, they've drawn the clitoral hood on here. Plus, as a bonus, you get the anus, which isn't a sex organ per se, but it's in the general area, and it just seems rude not to include it. So, the picture isn't bad, but I do have one major gripe with it. Namely that it labels the clitoris as this tiny little point that's part of the vulva, when in reality, the clitoris is actually a lot bigger and it wraps around a whole lot of stuff. Like this! See? Much bigger. When we start talking about the mechanics of sex, I'm going to come back to this because it's going to be critical. But for right now, it's enough that you know that the clitoris is not this tiny little point. Now, this is, let's call it the standard market issue of female internal sex organs. My favorite thing about this picture is how much it looks like an alien. Coming up from the bottom, we start with the vagina. Basic facts of the vagina are these. It is the birth canal, and while we have other options available to us today, it's still the way the majority of humans enter the world. Vaginas are very stretchy and don't seem to have a standard shape or size. They've been described as spherical, pear-shaped. I read one article that called one fish-shaped. They're currently thought to be between 2.5 and 6 inches deep, which is a pretty wide range, with the option to become deeper during arousal. So, yeah, they're not at all standard. Between the vagina and the upper part of the uterus, we have the cervix. The cervix is also a canal, although a much shorter one than the vaginal canal, and it's mostly just a tight ring of muscles that keep the baby in place in the uterus until it's time for it to exit. The main part of the uterus is where fetuses grow from tiny little blastocytes to tiny little people. It's also where the blood comes from when females have their periods. The ovaries produce female sex hormones. They're also covered with tiny little follicles that swell and rupture to release an egg when ovulation occurs. The fallopian tubes, which have these feather-like doohickeys on the end, sweep up the egg and carry it along to the uterus. So, that's the standard female set. Here is the male set. Again, there are worse cartoons. The male genitals from the bottom up include the scrotal sac, which holds the testicles, the penis, which is made up of the shaft and the glans or head, and the urethra. This is an uncircumcised penis we're being shown here. If it were circumcised, the glans would be rounder, but they function the same either way. And now the male standard internal sex organ, also an alien. The testes, or testicles, produce sperm, as well as testosterone. The seminal vesicles and the prostate both produce fluids that mix with the sperm to create the male ejaculate, called semen. Sperm travel down the vas deferens, mix with the fluid from the seminal vesicles, pass through the prostate substance, and then the whole mixture is ejaculated out of the penis. And again, this is just your typical male. So, remember the bell curve? Most of the center of the bell curve is born with one of these two configurations. As for either ends, we're going to come back to that in just a minute. First, let's talk chromosomes. Quick catch up for anyone who hasn't had biology. A typical human cell contains 23 pairs of chromosomes for a total of 46, and those carry the blueprint for your body. 22 of those pairs are the same, regardless of sex. One pair, the sex chromosomes, differ based on sex. You with me? Good. If you've had any kind of human biology, you've probably been exposed to the following approximation of a fact.
Sex in a human is determined by the pairing of two chromosomes. Females have an XX chromosome pattern, and males have an XY pattern. That's all. We're done here. Nothing more to talk about.
I think I just channeled my 7th grade science teacher. Anyway, it's true that your typical human is born with either an XX or an XY chromosome pattern, and that most of those born with an XX chromosome pattern are also the proud possessors of a set of female sex organs, while those born with an XY pattern have a male set of sex organs. Those are the standard sets that come with the standard pairings. But sometimes things aren't standard. I hope everyone enjoys the following trip down the biological rabbit hole. Babies born with Swyer syndrome are born with an XY chromosome pattern, which means that, according to biology class, they ought to have a male set of genitals, right? Instead, they're born with external female genitalia and non-functioning ovaries. Without treatment, they won't go through pubescence, but with treatment, they can experience a normal female pubescence. And while they can't produce their own eggs, if they implant a fertilized embryo, they can carry a baby to term. Klinefelter syndrome is when babies are born with external male genitalia and are carrying 2 or more X chromosomes along with a Y. Some of these babies grow up with basically no difference from your typical male. Generally, the more X chromosomes they have, the more likely they are to have some sort of external symptom. Some grow a little taller, some have smaller testicles, some are sterile, but not all of them. The only way to positively diagnose Klinefelter syndrome is to do a genetic test. XYY is a pattern that can occur in babies born with male sex organs, and it has very few associated symptoms. Basically, the kids tend to be taller, have more acne, and they have a slightly higher chance of learning difficulties. Again, in order to diagnose, you need a genetic test. XX male syndrome is super rare, but like the name suggests, it's when a baby is born with an XX chromosome pattern and male sex organs. Now, this can come in 3 different forms. There are babies who have what we deem consistent male structure both internally and externally. So essentially, they appear to be typical males, but they have a different chromosome pattern. There are babies with an XX chromosome pattern that have male genitalia with what we call external ambiguities. Those are things like a misplaced urethra or a very small penis. And there are babies with XX patterns that have both external and internal ambiguities, meaning that in addition to having ambiguous external male genitalia, they also have internal male organs and some internal female organs. Androgen insensity syndrome is an intersex condition that refers to someone with an XY chromosome pattern, but who, for some reason or another, has cells that won't respond to male sex hormones. The baby can be born with sex organs that are fully male, fully female, or somewhere in between. Remember how some people fall on the edges of the bell curve instead of in the giant middle group when it comes to the sex organs they're born with? Well, if that's internal, it might mean that you were born with ovaries but no uterus, or that you've got most of the male internal organs but no vas deferens. If it's external, that might mean that you've got genitals that aren't defined as being strictly male or female. This cartoon represents the Quigley scale, and it was developed to give 7 subcategories for defining androgen insensitive syndrome. It's a good example of how different our genitalia can be. The point here is that whatever the norm is, there are actually a whole lot of possibilities for the human body. So when someone tells you that men are men and women are women and it all comes down to biology, you can feel confident in knowing that it's actually a lot more complicated than that. Now that we've talked about gender and biology on a broad scale, in our next episode, we're going to be talking more specifically about trans and cisgenders.
Vast difference.
Okay. The seminal vesicles. The seminal vesicles mix with the fluid from the seminal vesicles. Seminal vesicles. Pass through the prostrate substance. Mix with the fluid from the seminal vesicles. Seminal vesicles. Seminal vesicles.